And welcome to our second lecture on modernism and postmodernism. So we'll be looking at postmodernism, and if you'll remember when we talked about post-impressionism, we pretty much add post to indicate it's difficult to define this style. There's not a clear commonality. But I did pull this definition from the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, one of these authorities on modern art. So postmodernism refers to a reaction against modernism. It is a less cohesive movement than an approach and attitude toward art, culture, and society. Its main characteristics include anti-authoritarianism, or refusal to recognize the authority of any single or definition of what art should be, and the collapsing of the distinction between high culture and mass or popular culture, and between art and everyday life. Postmodern art and architecture can be also characterized by deliberate use of earlier styles and conventions and an eclectic mixing of different artistic and popular styles and mediums. So as you can see, it is difficult to define. I've also seen other definitions which I like, that postmodernism, pretty much there are questions of society, power, hierarchy, class, gender, race, etc. And in our next unit, contemporary is more about personal and group identity. But again, these are vague definitions because when we add post, it's difficult to define. So we're going to look at some feminist art, postmodern. So this goes along with the questions of gender and this theme of identity. So this is occurring during the 1970s, where we have this women's liberation movement. And it's a massive movement. I mean, we're talking from, to give it context, before this time period and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Supreme Court judge, women had to get their husband's permission to open a credit card, that type of thing. And so this women's movement changed much of society in terms of women's roles in society. And so we have feminist artists who come about as well. One such is Judy Chicago, The Dinner Party. And so you'll notice this is a big sculpture. Multimedia, it includes ceramics, stitchery, and it's quite large. And so this is a comment on women's roles. Consider how oftentimes in the women's sphere, there's this association of being homemakers and cooking. And so she's taking this idea of women cooking and she's bringing it into a new light. She's bringing it into a museum setting. It's on display still currently in a museum. This idea of cooking and women's roles into a museum setting. But she's also praising different historical figures. And so you'll see there are 13 table settings on each side of this triangle. And this goes along with the idea of the Last Supper. So there's this reference to Jesus and his 12 disciples, total of 13. So we're playing off a common theme in the history of art. And then the triangle is referencing more of the feminine, the female. And so here we have this interest in women's history, as well as challenging the sphere that primarily belongs to women of home cooking. And we'll see celebrating these common female roles. So we have each of these placemats where there's this beautiful stitching in which each of these characters are defined, each of these people of history. And so think of, for much of time, women, their form of education was learning how to stitch and learning how to embroider, create art, versus a male's education was more of a classical education. And so she's bringing this stitching, this previous formal education for women, into this setting and celebrating it, bringing it into a new light and discussing its contribution. And so each of these placemats are important people. Here's our good old Judith from our Judith and Holofernes, Hatshepsut. We would study her in the fall semester. And of course, each of the unique ceramic plates are referencing the female and female genitalia. And so it is quite challenging and shocking. So it's this mixed media. And so we have this celebration of important females in history, even like Emily Dickinson, just celebrating these popular females. We also have all of these names on the floor as well. And so it essentially celebrates about 1,000 women within this within this place setting of these tables. Here's Barbara Kruger, entitled, also called Your Gaze Hits the Side of My Face, referencing the text on it. So here we have this marble-looking statue, this female head, and this very clear text right here. And so what she's doing is she's referencing the male gaze. She's bringing it to light. And notice her word choice here with hits. It's this aggressive notion. And so we've discussed this, the archetype of the female and the history of modern art. This female nude has been important. And as well as many females are portrayed in a way that is appealing to the male gaze. And she's drawing your attention to that. Remember how I talked about how there's different methodologies and how we add that lens in front of our eyes to see art through that lens? This is a time period when the feminist methodology is now brought forth, and how this is when even the word, the male gaze, comes to light in art history. And so this is where you would add that lens of seeing past artworks through the male gaze. Again, all these methodologies are just adding this lens. Here we also have the Gorilla Girls. This is a group of anonymous women who would wear these masks. Now, this is gorilla, Gorilla. Notice how we have guerrilla. This is like guerrilla warfare, especially post the Vietnam War, where one of the reasons why we lost is because of the guerrilla warfare of the Viet Cong and how they weren't doing what we're used to of our normal battles. Lining up against one another pretty much to an extent. And so they're approaching art differently and they're challenging art differently. And so here are some of the posters they would create. Do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. This is a real statistic from 1989. So here we have our good old reference to our painting, but with our gorilla head on top. And so it's drawing light to this inequality here with female artists versus females who are depicted. And here we have Cindy Sherman, untitled film still, number 35. So she includes herself, this is her and all of her artworks. And what she's done is she's referencing this typical subject matter. Like here's a female cleaning the house, etc. But it also looks like it's a film still, right? All of them look like a film still, like it was what you took from the old school film movies. And so these aren't actual film stills. They're not from anything, but they look like it. And so she's interested in how gender is socially constructed, how females are portrayed in movies, etc., how the male gaze is also seen in movies and photographs, etc. And she argues the male gaze is the usual viewer when looking at females in different mediums. And so she draws light to this. And so here she is looking over her shoulder. We can tell she is reacting in a little bit of an angry way to whoever is behind her. And so she's challenging these notions of the male gaze and the role of females. Here's another one titled In the City. And here is another untitled. Now this should look familiar. What's being depicted here? Judith and Holofernes, which we've seen several times. This is one of her later works, 1990. And so in this case, she's not including, it's not black and white. It doesn't look like a film still. Instead, she's experimenting with this idea of staging, where hers is extremely dramatic. She has these random cloths behind her, or over-exaggerated, I should say. She's put on this makeup. She's even painted her feet. She has this almost seemingly haphazardly costume put together. And then she's holding this head, which she purchased from a Halloween shop or whatnot. This richly decorated background, but she's commenting on modern mediums of photography, etc. But she's also commenting on the role of the artist, where she is the photographer, she is the subject, she is the costumer, the hairdresser, the makeup artist. In the previous ones, she was the film director. And so she's questioning these normal roles of women, and instead she herself is putting herself into all these different roles and proving that women can do all of this. And so she's also referencing classical work in a different way. So I debated bringing in neopop. In your textbook, it's in the contemporary chapter, but I'm going to bring it into this one because I think it's more under postmodernism. Jeff Koons is particularly. So this is Jeff Koons' Pink Panther. And here's a better reflection of this quote from the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York. So it's less a cohesive movement than approach and attitude toward art, culture, and society. And in this case, we're really looking at collapsing of the distinction between high culture and mass or pop culture, between art and everyday life. And so here, Jeff Koons pulls these very pop culture characters and places them into a fine arts museum. Here's a depiction of Jane Mansfield. She's pretty much this like sex icon of the 50s and 60s from before, like an alternate to Marilyn Monroe by a different studio. She was even in Playboy. Versus here is the Pink Panther, which was a very popular cartoon for decades. And so there's also this notion of artistic appropriation. He did not create the Pink Panther, and Jane Mansfield is a real female actress. And so he's influenced by pop art. He's challenging the distinction between high art and pop culture, etc. And also it's really kitsch, like really tacky. So he's bringing tackiness and kitsch into fine art as well. And it's made of porcelain. Think of how we looked at porcelain in our Chinese art and how this is a very fine art and expensive medium. And so he's challenging the mediums as well, and consumerism and historical genre, portraiture, pop, etc. Here's Jane Mansfield. He's also known for these balloons. So these huge sculptures of these metal balloon animals. Again, think of a balloon animal is made at like carnivals or kid parties, etc. And so he's pulling that into the museum setting. He's challenging the distinction between them. This was during the 80s, so we have Michael Jackson and his monkey bubbles. This is one of his famous artworks. However, with this appropriation, this has led to him being sued. So here is his Facture de Hervé. It was estimated to go on sale for $4 to $6 million. He's really popular at this point, but it's explicit appropriation. This was a campaign, I believe it was for a perfume company. Either way, he clearly pulled directly from this. So there's this challenge of this appropriation if this was not his original idea. And he was, ordered to pay for it. So there's difficulties with that. Okay, let's talk about site-specific art, which really began in the 1960s. But your iconic site-specific art is Robert Smithson. And I a little bit referenced that with Claes Oldenburg with our spoon and cherry and how he had made that for that site specifically. But here we have your most famous site-specific art. It's environmental, land art as well, often called to that. And this involves the whole process of creation. So what he would do is Robert Smithson would go out to these very hard to reach areas. Like he would go out by helicopter and find, this is out in the middle of nowhere, the Great Salt Lake, Utah. It's difficult to get to. So what does that mean? We are outside of the museum setting. We are outside of the institution, the authority of the museum. And he's made, very far. Like it's difficult to get to these. He died when he was scouting out a new site and he fell out of the helicopter. But an important part about this artwork is the process, not only of creating it, but what happens over time. And so it's this process of moving the sand and these rocks, as well as how the changing rise and fall of the water surrounding it changes this art. It does not look the same way as it did in the 70s. The environment has impacted it. It has worn it away. And so one day this will disappear. Again, there's those challenges of that art being lost. But that was his intention. It's about the process, both in making it and over time. It's associated with minimalism as well because of its simplicity. There's no subject matter, etc. And so he also, he intends this to connect to the public. Again, think of like with minimalism and this universal appeal. But it is very far away from the public, out in the middle of nowhere. But you are encouraged to interact with the work as well. So that's very different. We've taken it out of the museum, where in a museum setting, you don't get close to the paintings or artworks. You stay away. Where this one, you are welcomed to walk around it and walk on top of it. But it exists in nature. It's made of natural medium, and it also will be affected by nature. So here's the spiral jetty. The end.